Saint Joseph of Copertino by the Reverend Angelo Postrovicki, OMC Englished and adapted by the Reverend Francis S. Laing, O.M.Cap. With 6 illustrations first published in St. Louis 1918. For Our Lady's Intentions. Preface. Some persons derive most benefit from reading the lives of the saints in which the supernatural and the extraordinary abound. They delight to see the wonderful display of the power of divine grace in so frail a creature as man. These biographies, that are written more for our admiration than for our imitation, strengthen our faith in the supernatural, and inspire us with a great confidence in the goodness and power of God. And certainly in these days we need to stimulate and strengthen a life of faith and trust in Providence. The rapturous flights of Saint Joseph of Copertino have hardly a parallel as to frequency and duration in the lives of the saints. What is related of Christina Mirabilis, who lived 1150 to 1224, has been suspected of exaggeration, but our saint, having lived in more recent times, this his miraculous characteristic could easily be established in an authentic manner. Father Postrovicki wrote his life of Saint Joseph on the occasion of the beatification of the saint, 1753. Pope Benedict XIV, to whom the work is dedicated, wished that for each fact related the episcopal and apostolic processes should be cited. This was done. Father Suiskens remarks that the caution of citing the official documents was well employed. Since the words of the psalmist, "God is wonderful in his saints," were verified in a singular manner in the life of Saint Joseph, it was fitting that the extraordinary facts of his life should be attested in such a manner that credence could not be denied them. Father Gattari regards these miracles as wrought in support of the doctrine of the real presence, the authority of the Pope, sacramental confession and the veneration due to saints, truths which in the time of the saint were impugned by the followers of Luther and other heretics. The fame of the flights of Saint Joseph spread throughout Europe and led to conversions as in the case of the Duke of Brunswick. Another explanation offered is, that these miracles counteracted the diabolical arts, witchcraft and necromancy, especially in the kingdom of Naples, and superstition then prevalent. To a degree our biography is a panegyric, with its drawbacks of generalization and superlatives, but it is by no means a dreary inventory of virtues and miracles. Some of the narratives, as in chapter 6 and 9, are very charming, invested with all that tender simplicity and charm, which voiced itself in the poetic narratives of the Fioretti. This first extensive biography of Saint Joseph of Copertino in English was made from Sincyl's German translation of Father Postrovicki's Life of the Saint. Only after years was it possible to procure the Italian original and verify the rendering. In the editions of Postrovicki of 1753 and 1767 the text is not divided into chapters. These, 30 in all, are indicated by Roman numerals at the beginning of paragraphs. The chapter titles and the references to the acts are printed in the margin. The division of the text and the chapter titles in the present work are new. The original marginal titles are preserved in part as subtitles in the table of contents. The numerous references to the acts in the original have been omitted. Likewise, in the interest of delicacy or conciseness, several passages in the body of the work, details of the canonization, sanctuary, etc., have been added. Other small additions have been made throughout the work, dates and names have been inserted, and obscure passages made clear. The editions used for these changes are marked in the bibliographical list. Many friends have aided in preparing this little book. The conventual fathers at Osimo kindly donated a copy of the first edition of Postrovicki. During a visit to Rome, Reverend Etiennes, Concordia, Kansas, procured for me several rare works. Some of the bibliographical details I owe to Reverend Edward Janito, O.M.C., Osimo, Reverend Michael Beale, O.F.M. Corky, Reverend Father Maurice, O.M.Cap. Quebec, and Reverend Engelbert Rosenmayer, O.M.Cap. Milwaukee. All these I sincerely thank, as, too, the Franciscan Fathers, Washington, and the Benedictine Fathers, Atchison, for the use of books, Reverend Felix M. Kirsch, O.M.Cap. Herman, Pennsylvania, and other fellow religious for suggestions toward improving the manuscript. F. S. L. Chapter 1 The Supernal Vocation, Phil. 3, 14, Copertino, the birthplace of our saint, is situated on the peninsula of Apulia, halfway between the Gulf of Taranto and the Strait of Otranto. In the 17th century the town belonged to the province of Otranto, Kingdom of Naples. But few particulars are recorded regarding the parents of Saint Joseph, Felix Dasa, and Francis Panera. Felix was a carpenter. Kind of heart, he had given security for the debts of others. As often happens, the debtors defaulted and the creditors seized Dasa's house and would have had him imprisoned had he not fled to a holy place which enjoyed the right of asylum. Meanwhile the mother of our saint fled from her home and, unable to reach the house of a friend, took refuge in a stable. Here, on June 17, 1603, a child was born. He was baptized in the Church of Our Lady of the Snow and received the name of Joseph Mary. As a child, Joseph was a spirited lad and inclined to anger. His mother strove to repress his exuberance of spirit and all manifestations of undue boldness by stern rebuke and kind admonition. She was so severe that in after years the saint used to say he needed no novitiate as a religious because he had passed a novitiate under his mother. These efforts of the pious mother bore abundant fruit. Joseph delighted in visiting the churches of his native city. At home he erected a little altar, before which he spent part of the day and the night reciting rosaries and litanies. At the age of 8 he experienced his first ecstasies. When, at school, he would hear the organ or the songs the teacher practiced with the more advanced scholars, he would let his book fall and remain immovable with eyes raised to heaven and lips parted. Owing to this his companions called him bocca aperta, open mouth. About this time Joseph was afflicted with painful ulcers. This trial he bore with extraordinary patience, seeking no other relief than the consolation of Holy Mass. Unable to walk, he entreated his mother to carry him in her arms to the church every morning. A hermit of some repute as a healer, who lived near the Church of Our Lady of Grace in Galatone, endeavored to cure the child by employing the surgical means then in vogue, but to no purpose. Long neglect had seemingly rendered the malady incurable. After 4 years of suffering God intervened. One day when the hermit had applied to the ulcer some oil taken from a lamp kept burning before an image of Our Lady of Grace, the boy suddenly felt relieved from all pain. With the aid of a cane he was then able to walk from the Church of Our Lady of Galatone to Copertino, a distance of 9 miles. Before his cure he could visit the hermit only by lying helpless on a horse led by his mother. It need hardly be said that the boy showed his gratitude by an increased love of God and greater zeal in his service. In his youth our saint was apprenticed to a cobbler. Cardinal Brancati has recorded many of the pious practices of this period of Joseph's life. Such were his frequent visits to various churches, assistance at Holy Mass and the wearing of a painful cilice. He abstained from all flesh meat, and contented himself with vegetables, which he seasoned with wormwood to give them a bitter taste. His fasts were so severe that he would at times abstain from all food for 2 or 3 consecutive days. His body was thus weakened, but his spirit was so lifted up to God that, when asked why he had eaten nothing, he would reply with charming grace, "I did not think of it." With the years there grew upon Joseph a desire to leave the deceitful world and unite himself more closely to God. Feeling a great attraction to the order of conventuals, he applied for assistance to his paternal uncle, Father Francis Tesa, a religious of that order. This priest, however, regarded his nephew as unfit for the exalted dignity of the priesthood because of his lack of education, and was unwilling to assist him. In spite of this refusal Joseph persevered in his resolve to enlist under the banner of the Holy Patriarch Saint Francis, whom to follow he felt called by a continued inspiration of God. He therefore humbly requested Father Antony of Francavilla, provincial of the Capuchins, to receive him into the order as a lay brother. His request was granted and he received the habit, taking the name of Stephen, in the monastery at Martina in August, 1620. The path of the novice was beset with difficulties. He was employed in the kitchen and refectory, but displayed a woeful lack of ability. At times he could not distinguish wheat bread from rye bread, often he broke dishes by letting them fall, upset pots in putting wood on the fire and committed other blunders of a similar nature. Some have ascribed this awkwardness to a defect of sight. Another and truer explanation is that his surroundings inflamed him with the fire of divine love to such a degree that his soul was continually enraptured. God, whose ways are wonderful, permitted that after a trial of 8 months Joseph was dismissed from the novitiate and deprived of the habit. This pained him so much that in after years he said, "It seemed to me as if my skin was torn off with the habit and my flesh rent from the bones." Little care had been taken of Joseph's secular apparel since his investment. His hat and shoes and stockings were not forthcoming, and bare of head and foot he set out for Vetrara, where his uncle, Father Francis Tesa, was then preaching the Lenten sermons. By thus avoiding Copertino he meant to escape ridicule and reproach. On the way he encountered great dangers. A number of savage shepherd dogs set upon him. The shepherds came to his aid but, owing to his unusual guise, suspected him of being a spy of the banditti and were about to lay violent hands on him when, fortunately, one of them recognized him. They then spoke kindly to him and gave him some bread. Finally a horseman of terrific form appeared to him with a sword in his hand, crying, "Halt, spy!" as if he were a spy of the royal government. Hardly had the saint gone a few steps farther when, on turning about, he found the rider had disappeared from the vast plain, and said to himself, "It was Malatesta," a name also used by Saint Catherine of Siena to denote the evil one, who wished to frighten me and drive me to despair. On his arrival at Vetrara he prostrated himself before his uncle and patiently bore his reproaches of good-for-nothing and vagabond. To his uncle's query as to his strange attire and visit, he replied in simple humility, "The Capuchin fathers have taken the habit from me because I am good for nothing." Moved by compassion, his uncle kept him till Easter, which in that year fell on April 11th, and then secretly brought him to Copertino. Joseph bore with invincible patience the upbraidings of his mother, who treated him with apparent severity, but in her heart loved him dearly. With tears she besought the civil authorities not to imprison him because of the debts of his father, who had died. Assisted by Father Francis Dasa, Father John Donatus, and other friars of the convent at Gratella, she finally obtained his admission as tertiary into the order of conventuals. God's design was that Joseph should become a priest in the order of conventuals. The religious regarded the pious tertiary with favor, and at the provincial chapter held at Altamora, he was received into the order as a cleric, June 19, 1625. He retained his baptismal name, Joseph, and joyfully began his novitiate in the monastery at Gratella. With great earnestness he endeavored to live for God alone and to acquire the knowledge necessary for the priesthood. He attained to a high degree of perfection by his withdrawal from all association with men in order to commune uninterruptedly with God in meditation. Other means which he employed were humility, patience, and obedience. Regarding himself as the most despicable sinner on earth, he often said he had received the habit out of pure mercy. He patiently bore the severest reproaches for faults he had never committed. With alacrity he executed the most difficult and seemingly impossible tasks, which his superiors imposed on him to probe his virtue. To this obedience was added severe mortification of the flesh, in short, the practice of all virtues, which in time led his fellow religious to consider him as a model of holiness. In studies Joseph made but little progress and was therefore often harshly rebuked by his novice master, to whom he would reply, "Have patience with me, you will thus acquire merit." In spite of his poor progress in learning he was admitted to solemn vows because of his great virtue and made his profession amid tears of joy. Trusting in God and his Holy Mother, whose powerful aid he had frequently implored, he received minor orders without previous examination. January 30, 1627, subdeaconship February 27, of the same year, and deaconship March 20. The examination on the latter occasion he passed in a providential manner, for the passage of the Gospel beginning with the words, "Blessed is the womb that bore thee," which the Bishop of Nardo gave him to explain, was the only one he had learned by long study and could well interpret. He was finally ordained priest March 28, 1628, by the Right Reverend John Baptist Detti, Bishop of Castro. This prelate was so pleased with the learning of the friars whom he had examined first, that he considered the others, among whom was Joseph, to be equally well prepared, and ordained them without examination. Chapter 2 is Gold in a Furnace, Wist. 3, 6. After ordination Joseph returned to the monastery at Gratella and before the image, which is venerated there, humbly thanked our Blessed Lady for the dignity of the priesthood. He said his first Holy Mass with great fervor and lively faith, and was favored with heavenly enlightenment. On touching the sacred body of Jesus Christ he was seized with a holy dread and, believing himself unworthy of so sublime an office, he prayed for purity of heart and hands. Prompted by great love of God, he resolved anew to die entirely to the world and to lead a supernatural life. To have left the companionship of men for a narrow and dark cell seemed to the saint a small sacrifice, and so he likewise left the company of his brothers in religion. He often retired to a small room above the vault of the church, or to a chapel dedicated to Saint Barbara in an olive grove near the monastery, and there prayed unceasingly, meditated on divine things, and experienced sweet ecstasies and rapturous flights. Not only during the 16 years of his stay at Gratella, but during his whole life, these ecstasies and flights were so frequent, as attested in the acts of the process of beatification, that for more than 35 years his superiors would not permit him to take part in the exercises in the choir in the refectory or in processions, lest he disturb the community. To avoid interruptions in the narrative, and for the sake of brevity, a later chapter will treat of these ecstasies. Now we shall describe his virtuous life at Gratella. With heroic fortitude Joseph deprived himself of the few utensils and objects which religious are allowed for personal use, by giving them to his superior. All superfluous garments he likewise disposed of and, casting himself at the foot of a crucifix, he prayed, "Look upon me, Lord, I am divested of all things, thou art my only good, I regard all else as a danger and ruin to my soul." About this time he felt such sadness of heart and such privation of heavenly consolation that he suffered agonies, and this trial continued 2 full years. Finally God deigned to comfort his servant, who had remained faithful to him in so great a trial. One day, when, feeling far removed from all help and, lying on his bed, he cried out, Amid many sobs and tears, "My Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" A stranger in religious garb, whom he believed to be an angel, suddenly stood before him and gave him a new habit. Hardly had Joseph put on this habit, when all sadness passed away and joyousness of heart returned. The saint severely chastised his body in order to subject it to the spirit. During his priestly life he abstained from bread for 5 years, from wine for 10 years, and ate only herbs, dried fruits and beans, to which he added a powder, which several religious who tasted it described as of unspeakable bitterness. The vegetables which he ate on Fridays were of such repugnant savor that a friar who tasted them with the tip of his tongue, was so sickened that for several days all food caused him nausea. The saint's fast was practically uninterrupted, for he observed the 7 fasts of 40 days each, practiced by Saint Francis, so strictly that for the most part he abstained from all food except on Sundays and Thursdays. He sustained life by the bread of angels, which was his daily food. No matter how faint he felt before receiving Holy Communion, after receiving he was strong and of healthy color. His weakened stomach could bear no meat, and once, when he ate some out of obedience, he had to vomit. At times his throat would close, so that he could take food only with difficulty. He slept little, and this on a bed which was more a bed of pain than a place of rest. He continually lacerated his body with a scourge studded with needles, pins, and star-shaped pieces of steel, which caused him to lose so much blood that the walls of his cell and the other places, already mentioned, to which he withdrew, were seen to be sprinkled and, as it were, covered with blood. In addition to these scourgings he used a silicon chain and a large flat piece of iron, which so tightened the silicon chain that they penetrated into the flesh. One day his superior found him covered with wounds, and noticing that he could hardly breathe, commanded him to relinquish these instruments of penance. By this manner of life Joseph became a prodigy of all virtues and was made worthy to enjoy in excess of divine favors, ecstasies and flights, frequent miracles and other heavenly gifts. The fame of our saint spread abroad, especially after he had been appointed associate of the Father Provincial on all his journeys in the province of Bari. On such occasions the people came from far and near to see him, to hear his teachings and implore his prayers. He was usually called the apostle of the country, and all places he visited experienced the effects of his great charity. A vicar general, not knowing the saintliness of Joseph, accused him before the Inquisition at Naples. The accusation was that he went about attracting the people to himself as to another Messias, and at every turn performed works which the credulous believed to be miracles. The Inquisition accordingly directed the Father Guardian of Gratella to send Father Joseph to Naples. 3 years before a religious had asked Joseph whether he would like to go to Naples, and in reply the saint had predicted that in course of time he would go thither, but at the command of the Holy Office. Shortly before his summons to Naples, Jesus forewarned him of his impending trial by appearing to him during meditation in the form of a child, poorly clad, and carrying a large cross on his shoulder. At another time, when Joseph had erected several crosses on the way from Gratella to Copertino to stimulate devotion, he heard a voice saying, "Leave alone the dead crosses and take hold of the living ones." On receiving the letter of the Holy Office, Joseph humbly set out for Naples, October 21, 1638. The inhabitants of Copertino deplored his departure and said, "Alas, what a loss for us!" Joseph, however, left with a peaceful heart and joyful countenance and, amid ecstasies and sufferings, arrived at Naples and took up his abode in the monastery of St. Lawrence. Here he found the religious, who well knew the cause of his journey, in great consternation. They received him unwillingly, and the saint was much distressed that he, though innocent, should cause anxiety to his fellow religious. Sad of heart he went next morning with his usual companion, Brother Louis, to the building of the Inquisition, but on the way he was joined by a young religious of graceful and comely appearance, who encouraged and comforted him. When Joseph was about to enter the palace of the Inquisition he no longer saw the youth, and as Brother Louis affirmed that he had not seen him, Joseph believed that Saint Antony had appeared to strengthen him. It was therefore with a cheerful spirit that he presented himself before the sacred tribunal. He was detained several weeks and examined 3 times, but no shadow of fault was discovered and his life was found to be worthy of admiration. On seeing him dismissed so soon and with such honor, his brethren in religion rejoiced much that his holiness had stood the test and had been found pure and free from hypocrisy. After this his piety became better known, so that many people of Naples, even nobles, came to see him and make his acquaintance. Joseph alone did not share this high opinion of his person, but styled himself a sinner, who knew not how to live with his brethren in religion and deserved to remain with the beasts of burden. This he said to the nuns of St. Ligorio at Naples. At the command of the Inquisition he had said Mass in their church, dedicated to St. Gregory of Armenia, and there was raised in ecstasy above the altar. This occurrence so increased the fame of His Holiness that it penetrated to the royal palace, and the viceroy with his wife and court wished him to say Mass in their chapel. Difficulties intervened, the function was postponed, and in the meantime the saint left the city and thus evaded the contemplated honor. Chapter 3. Fellow citizen of the Seraphic Francis, Saint Joseph. Upon the command of the Holy Office, Joseph had left Naples for Rome with important messages for the Father General of the Order. During this journey his spirit was absorbed in contemplation of divine things. On seeing the Holy City, the center of the Catholic world, he desired to enter it in poverty after the example of his Holy Father, Saint Francis. When, therefore, they had come to the walls of the city, he bade his companion, Brother Louis, to lay their last piece of money, a small silver coin, on a stone for the benefit of the first one who should pass. When Joseph arrived at the monastery of the 12 Apostles within the city, the Father General, John Baptist Berardicelli, who had never before met him, received him at first with great reserve and forbidding mien, for the message of the Holy Office directed him to send Joseph to some solitary monastery. The general had the most secluded room of the monastery assigned to him with the injunction to remain there till further disposition were made. The general had in mind to send him to one of the smallest and most secluded monasteries. Meanwhile it pleased God to reward the humble resignation of His servant amid such great and painful trials by revealing His holiness not only to his brethren in religion, but even to the cardinals and the supreme head of the Church, Pope Urban VIII. The Pope commanded the Father General to send Father Joseph to a monastery in which the rule was most perfectly observed. This caused the Father General to alter his plans and to send Joseph to the monastery at Assisi. The command gave the saint great pleasure, for he had long desired to live near the tomb of his Holy Father, Saint Francis. Without delay he therefore set out with Brother Louis and full of joy arrived at Assisi the last day of April, 1639. Joseph's joy was of short duration, for God wished to try His servant anew, and, as it were, by fire, by withdrawal of consolation, by persecutions, temptations and spiritual dryness which should purify his soul more effectively than the earlier trials at Gratella. Soon after Joseph's arrival at Assisi, Father Antony of St. Maur was appointed custos of the place. Although, as provincial of the province of Bari, he had tenderly loved Joseph and taken him for his companion, he now, certainly not without the design of heaven, changed his conduct. He treated the pious Joseph at first with haughtiness, then with contempt, and finally threatened and repeatedly punished him, calling him a useless hypocrite and publicly reproving him as such. The courageous saint regarded all this as a source of merit, and not only bore these bitter reproaches and accusations in silence, but evinced even greater humility and greater readiness to serve his superior. In addition to these trials on the part of the custos, the Lord began gradually to withdraw the consolations which had heretofore given Joseph courage. The saint had no longer either ecstasies or heavenly delights. On the contrary, he experienced aridity during spiritual reading, when praying the divine office, at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, in short, in all divine things. God seemed to be deaf to his voice, unmoved by his tears, and sensible to his requests, so that poor Joseph was oppressed by a deep gloom, which seemed to break his heart and manifested itself in his dim and tired eyes. The devil frequently assailed the saint with terrible temptations, suggesting to him impure thoughts and disturbing his sleep by most hideous dreams. To these assaults, which lasted almost 2 years, Joseph, though terrified, offered continual resistance, so that the inner citadel of his soul remained firm and unshaken, God's superabundant grace strengthening him in keeping with the severity of his sufferings. Remembering the delights of spirit he had enjoyed when near Our Lady of Gratella, whom he was wont to call his mother, Joseph thought of returning thither. To a fellow religious he said, "I should like to return to Our Lady of Gratella, for she is my mother." The Father General, however, learning of Joseph, summoned him to Rome to keep him there during the whole of Lent, 1644. While on the way with his companion, he was seized with a great desire to return to his beloved shrine of the Blessed Virgin and thought of asking his superior for leave to go. In his soul, however, he heard the voice of God chiding him because of this innocent but vain desire, and saying, "What desirest thou? What seekest thou? What demandest thou? Am I not the same here as there?" Enlightened by these words, Joseph stood still, raised his eyes to heaven and said to his companion, "My brother, we shall soon return to Assisi." And, indeed, after a brief stay at Rome, where God again opened to him his bountiful hand and made him partake of heavenly sweetness and ecstasies of love, Joseph returned to Assisi. His return was a source of joy to the religious and the citizens of Assisi. On his arrival he was led into the church and, seeing on the ceiling a picture of Our Lady similar to that at Gratella, he cried, "Ah, my dear mother, you have followed me," and was lifted about 18 paces into the air, as if to embrace the picture. Several days later, on seeing a true copy of the Virgin of Gratella, which Father Michelangelo Catalano, assistant to the general, gave to him, he repeated the ejaculation, "Ah, my mother!" hastened toward the picture, and with his eyes fixed upon it remained a long time in delightful ecstasy. Chapter 4. Caught up into paradise. Calm had now followed the storm, and a love so powerful and tender possessed our saint, that his noble soul seemed united more to God than to the body and, as it were, immersed in a limitless ocean of love. Owing to this love it happened that, whenever he heard songs or music in church, or a conversation about God, or the names of Jesus and Mary, he would be enraptured and cry out, "O love, O love!" or would sing sacred songs. Among these was one to Saint Catherine of Siena, whom he venerated as his special patron. When, in the song, he came to the words, "And the divine love pierced her hands and feet, and even her heart," he would weep, tremble all over, and, with a corresponding gesture, say, "Open my breast, cleave this heart." To the question, what he desired most, he replied, "That God take my heart, my whole heart." Before an image of the crucified Savior he would often pray, "I desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ," or "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus, draw me to thee, I cannot remain here, sweetest Jesus, draw me up to where thou art." In the holy season of Christmas, the saint joyfully invited all to sing with him the song, "Bambino, my bambino, give, oh, give to me but a small share of thy divine love." At times, especially during Holy Week, he was sad and, on meeting anyone, would lament and say, "Think of it, my son, Jesus has been scourged, Jesus has been crucified, Jesus has died and has died for love." After various other ejaculations, he would usually conclude with the words, "I am much worse than the Jews, for I know who thou art, and yet crucify thee." On such days he pined away in sorrow and lay as dead in a swoon. But when Easter came, he sang and exulted for hours together for joy, and on Pentecost he would glow with the same divine fire and display a like jubilation of spirit. By such manifestations of holy love he aroused similar sentiments in the hearts of others and endeavored to stimulate them still more by saying to them, "Love God, for he who loves is rich without knowing it." His desire was that the whole world should love God. He therefore wept on seeing how men offend God by so many sins, and because of this felt such agony that blood gushed from his mouth. Gladly would he have shed his blood in martyrdom and, to accomplish this, desired to accompany some missionary as companion and servant to the heathen. Wishing to see all have a like desire, he would ask each religious, even the novices, "Would you gladly die for Jesus Christ?" And, when they answered in the affirmative, he would exult in his heart and manifest unusual joy. The saint's love at times found expression in words that show his desire to be utterly unselfish. "My Lord," said he, "even if I knew that thou hadst predestined me to hell at my creation, yet I would follow thee in every possible way and serve thee by all such works as have been practiced by the greatest saints of paradise." In this event he would have wished to be alone, so as not to hear the blasphemies and curses of others. He therefore added, "I would wish to be in a place apart, so that I should not hear the others blaspheme and curse. In that solitary place I would bless and praise God in spite of hell." Once, on Christmas Eve, when Joseph heard the sound of the bagpipes and flutes of some shepherds, whom he had invited to celebrate with him the birth of the heavenly child, he began to dance because of excessive joy and, with a sob and a loud cry, flew as a bird through the air from the middle of the church to the high altar, a distance of almost 40 feet. There he remained about a quarter of an hour in sweet rapture, without, however, disturbing any of the many lighted candles or burning his clothes. The shepherds marveled exceedingly. Great was the wonderment of the religious and the people of Copertino on the occasion of a procession on the feast of Saint Francis. Joseph, dressed in a surplice, rose up to the pulpit, about 15 palms from the floor, and remained a long time suspended in ecstasy with outstretched arms and bent knees. Marvelous, too, was his rapture during the night of Holy Thursday while praying with other religious before the Holy Sepulchre, which was erected above the high altar and lit with many lamps. Suddenly he rose in direct flight to the chalice, in which his divine treasure was enclosed, but without touching any of the many decorations, and only after some time, when called by a superior, did he return to his former place. At times he made similar flights to the altar of St. Francis or, while praying the litany, to that of Our Lady of Gratella. Very remarkable was his exuberance of love when the saint erected a Calvary on a hill between Copertino and the monastery at Gratella. 2 crosses were already placed, but 10 persons with united effort could not raise the third, which was 54 palms high and very heavy. On seeing this Joseph, full of ardor, flew about 80 paces from the portal of the monastery to the cross, lifted it as easily as if it were a straw, and placed it in the hole prepared for it. These crosses were the object of his special devotion, and from a distance of 10 or 12 paces, he, drawn by his crucified Savior, would rise to one of the arms or the top of the cross. One day a religious was speaking with a saint about the descent of the Holy Ghost on the apostles. Just then a friar happened to pass with a burning candle in his hand, at sight of which Joseph uttered a cry and flew 4 paces into the air, and flamed with the fire of the Holy Ghost. Another time, hearing a priest say, "Father Joseph, oh, how beautiful God has made heaven," he flew up on an olive tree and remained there half an hour kneeling, and it was a strange sight to see how the branch which bore him swayed as lightly as if a small bird rested on it. On one occasion Joseph was present at the investment of several nuns in the church of St. Clare at Copertino. As soon as the choir intoned the antiphon, "Come, thou bride of Christ," he was seen to hurry from the corner in which he knelt towards the confessor of the convent, a member of the order of the Reformati, grasp him by the hand, lift him by supernatural power from the floor, and rapidly dance about with him in the air. It would lead too far to recount all the raptures and flights through the air while the saint was at Copertino. Suffice it to say that, according to the acts of his beatification, more than 70 such flights were recorded, not counting those which occurred daily at Holy Mass and generally lasted 2 hours. On another occasion Joseph terrified several painters, who remarked in his presence that they meant to paint a picture of the Immaculate Conception in his little chapel. They first heard him cry out in great agitation, "What? The Conception of the Virgin Mary? The Immaculate Conception?" And then they saw him remain for more than half an hour deprived of the use of his senses and immovable with outspread arms and eyes lifted to heaven, enraptured in contemplation of the sublime mystery. Great was the astonishment of a priest who, in company with Joseph, once entered a village church. The priest inquired, "Do you think the Blessed Sacrament is preserved here?" As no lamp was burning, the saint replied, "Who knows?" But immediately he cried out aloud and flew towards the tabernacle, embraced it and adored the Blessed Sacrament, which he miraculously knew to be present. Several religious, whom he assisted to clean a reliquary and to fold a habit worn by Saint Francis, saw him hover in the air above their heads. Others saw him suspended on a cornice in the chapel of Saint Francis, 16 palms from the floor. One day, while a priest was preaching to the faithful in the chapel of Saint Ursula, Joseph flew from a jalousied balcony, which jutted out in front of the altar at some distance from the floor. He remained suspended in a kneeling posture and, with face all radiant as that of a seraph, fixed his eyes on the tabernacle till, at the command of his superior, he flew back to the balcony. Great was the surprise and terror of the Father Custos on one occasion, when solemn vespers had been sung in honor of the Immaculate Conception in the chapel of the novitiate. Joseph entreated the Father to repeat with him the words, "Beautiful Mary." He then seized the Father. Chapter 5 Good Odor of Christ. These ecstasies and flights were, no doubt, effects of the divine love which burned in the heart of our saint and evidenced the union of his soul with God. Father Jerome Rodriguez, a pious and learned priest of the Society of Jesus, once said after conversing with Joseph, "He is perfectly united to God and his heart is more disposed to this union than powder is to be ignited by the smallest spark." This union was fostered by unfound expression and continued prayer. Almost without effort the saint raised his spirit to God, whom he found ready to enlighten and inflame him and to draw him towards himself. It was as if in looking towards heaven he saw the beauty of paradise spread out before his eyes, as he once said to Cardinal Brancati, speaking as of a third person. It appeared to him as if he were in the midst of a large gallery filled with beautiful and rare objects, and saw in a bright mirror hanging there, at a single glance, the forms of all things and could with certainty pronounce the hidden mysteries which it pleased God to reveal to him while this sublime union lasted. His customary cry was an effect of the inner fire which could not be confined to his breast, but forcibly broke forth from his lips, as he himself said, though again as of a third person, like to powder proceeding from the cannon's mouth, causing a loud report. This great vehemence often raised with the soul the body and any object he happened to have hold of. He even sang and danced during these joyful ecstasies. By reason of his abstraction from earthly things the saint often did not understand what others said to him, or gave answers which plainly showed that he used natural things only as a ladder to mount to the contemplation of the supernatural. Once, on a journey, he met several women, and when a religious asked him whether he recognized them, he replied, they were perhaps the Blessed Virgin, Saint Clare, and Saint Catherine. Other times, when asked regarding other persons, he mentioned various saints. He was very attentive when reciting the canonical hours or saying his prayers, as is evinced by his many tears and the impression of his knees at the foot of the altar and on the floor of his oratory. He prayed with lively faith and firm hope in God and said to others, "Children, trust in God alone, for God alone can provide for you. Men fail, God never fails." And again, "He who has faith, is Lord of the earth." As to himself, he said that he trusted in God, and that he was like a man cast by accident on an ocean reef, where, surrounded by water, he could expect no help, but from God alone. If necessary he would remove mountains in the strength of this faith, from one end of the earth to the other. This lively faith it was that rendered his prayers effective. He once prayed that Copertino and its territory be spared in a severe storm, and the hurricane ceased at once. At another time he prayed while a heavy downpour of rain frightened the inhabitants and threatened the vicinity of the convent at Gratella. When, after his prayer, he ran out of the church and cried, "Dragon, dragon," the clouds fled before him and the sky cleared. Once, when the heat of the sun had parched the fields near the same place, a procession was held to implore aid, and, as the saint had foretold, a plentiful rain fell immediately after. It was owing to Joseph's prayers that Alcide Fabiani, a surgeon, passed unnoticed 6 assassins who sought to waylay him on his return from Spello to Assisi. By his prayer he saved the Father General of his order from the danger of drowning in a deep trench, called Canera, near the village of Montefalco. The father, with his frightened mule, had fallen from a bridge, and in falling had commended himself to Joseph, who was then still living. On seeing the Father General later, the saint said to him, "Certainly, my dear Father General, you were in great peril, for you had a dangerous fall at 10 o'clock, just as I was saying Mass, and I prayed to God for you." The efficacy of his prayers is strikingly shown in the conversion to the Catholic faith of a Lutheran prince, John Frederick, Duke of Brunswick. While visiting the principal courts of Europe, in the year 1649, the prince, then 25 years of age, came from Rome to Assisi expressly to see Joseph, of whose fame he had heard in Germany. On his arrival at the monastery, he was given lodging in the rooms reserved for persons of rank and, as he wished to speak with Joseph and then continue his journey, he, with 2 of his retainers, one a Catholic, the other a Protestant, was led next morning to the door of the chapel, where the servant of God was saying Mass. The saint, who was not informed of their presence, was made aware of it when about to break the sacred host, which he found so hard, that, in spite of all his efforts, he could not break it, but had to replace it on the potton. Fixing his eyes upon the host, he wept and with a loud cry rose in kneeling posture about 5 paces into the air. With another cry he returned after some time to the altar and broke the sacred host, though with great effort. At the instance of the Duke, the Father Superior asked him why he had wept, and he replied, "My dear compatriot, the persons, whom you sent to my Mass this morning, have a hard heart, for they do not believe all that Holy Mother Church teaches, and therefore the Lamb of God was hardened in my hands so that I could not break the sacred host." The Duke, astonished at this occurrence, deferred his departure in order to consult with the servant of God. This he did after dinner, remaining with the saint till Compline. Moved by divine grace, the Duke wished again to assist at Holy Mass on the following day. At the elevation, the cross on the host appeared black to all present, and the saint, with his usual cry, was raised up a palm from the floor, and remained about a quarter of an hour in this position, elevating the host. On seeing this miracle the Duke wept, but his companion, the Lutheran, said angrily, "Cursed be the hour in which I came to this country, for at home I was much more at peace and now my conscience is tormented by the furies of doubt." Joseph, enlightened from above, assured one of his friends of the future conversion of the prince in the following words, "Let us be of good cheer, the deer is wounded." The prince conversed with Joseph till midday. On seeing the Duke return to his cell after vespers, the saint hurried towards him, girded him with his girdle, and said with great fervor, "For paradise I bind you, go, venerate Saint Francis, assist at Compline, follow with devotion in the procession, and do all as you see the friars do." The prince humbly obeyed, promised to become a Catholic, and with his own hand inscribed himself in the register of the Arch-Confraternity of the Court of St. Francis. Before publicly abjuring heresy, he returned home to arrange his affairs. The following year he came to Assisi and, as he had promised, knelt before the Blessed Sacrament, and in the presence of Cardinals Facchinetti and Rapaccioli, made profession of faith in the hands of Father Joseph. Ever after the Duke remained devoted to his benefactor. Very numerous are the miracles God wrought through the intercession of his servant Joseph. We will content ourselves with adding these words from the process of beatification. His prayer was never in vain, but always obtained what he implored for the welfare of the soul and body. Even those who merely commended themselves to him, received the desired favor at the moment he prayed for them. Knowing that all good comes of prayer and wishing his neighbor all good, he frequently exhorted others by saying, "Pray, pray." Joseph's charity was such that he prayed without ceasing for all men, for the just, that they might persevere in God's grace, and for sinners, that they might amend their life and do penance. To render his prayer effective, he would at times implore God to bear, as with the past, so, too, with the present sins of the world. At other times he would severely chastise his body to make atonement, in some measure, for the sins of others. When others recommended themselves to his prayers, he would kindly reply, "Take refuge to God, and I, on my part, will not fail to pray for you." When such as were troubled with doubts came to him he repeated to them the words, "Scruples and melancholy I tolerate not in my house." After counseling and comforting them he would in such cases jestingly take a broom, sweep them from head to foot, and say, "See, I have taken all scruples from your back, do good, have a pure intention, and cast off all doubts." Whenever he saw or heard of dissension he was very desirous to put an end to it and usually succeeded in restoring peace. His conversation was unaffected, yet so interesting that he captivated the hearts of all who heard him. It was his wish that all should be upright and gentle in their intercourse. He detested deceit, pride, and ostentation, and exhorted all, even his superiors, to compassion, gentleness, and love. He frequently repeated such sayings as, "Love, oh, love, he who is love is rich and knows it not, who is not love, has nothing, he is unhappy without knowing it." Love and charity make for happiness. On seeing anyone perform an act of charity, he rejoiced and would even embrace such a person, as he once did a religious who had put an end to a dissension between certain persons by pacifying their anger. He said to him, "God bless you, my dear son. May Saint Francis bless you, for you have acted as a true son of his." This tender charity he recommended to others and practiced himself, even towards those who offended him. One who had insulted him was rewarded by a miracle. Another who had wounded him with a knife because of a reproof, he won by gentleness and forbearance, at the same time advising him of his approaching end. Yet another, who was on the point of attacking him in anger, he tenderly embraced. Another fruit of his charity was his zeal. In the monastery he severely reprimanded those who transgressed the rule, and admonished his superiors to be vigilant. Sometimes he impetuously approached and reproved the transgressors, as once at Assisi, on seeing two persons engaged in vain discourse in the Basilica of St. Francis. His charity extended also, as far as obedience would permit, to the bodily needs of his fellowmen. Even in the seclusion of his cell he knew by divine enlightenment of their wants and aided them by his prayer. Where he had full liberty to act, he hastened to the aid of the sick within and without the monastery, admonished them to resign themselves to the will of God, and cheered them by words of good counsel. With joyful countenance he would kindly say to such as feared death or were sad for other reasons, "Be of good cheer, God will provide for you." He was ever ready to render them the most humble services. He lifted them up, fed them, and bandaged their wounds. In short, his love for the sick was so great that his fellow religious were accustomed to say, "It were better to be sick than to be well." When with Joseph, as in the former case he lived only for the sick, in the latter only for himself. His charity toward the sick was, moreover, so pleasing to God that he glorified the saint by miraculous cures. The affection of his tender heart was manifested especially during a disastrous famine in Assisi and the adjoining provinces. He wept and prayed without ceasing to implore aid from God, and, as he was not allowed to beg for the support of the hungry outside the monastery, he anxiously went about within the precincts of the convent to comfort and cheer at least his spiritual brethren. Gratitude prompted him, in view of his poverty, to reward his benefactors by thanking and blessing them, by praying for and promising ever to remember them. Once he spoke winningly to a surgeon who had rendered him aid, "Be blessed for the great kindness you have shown me, God will reward you for it, and I will not forget to pray for you when I shall come to the abode of the blessed." Joseph's gratitude towards the Blessed Virgin Mary, to whose intercession he ascribed all benefits he received from God, was most extraordinary. He sought to show her a love than which none could be more tender and deep. In infancy his mother instilled into him devotion towards Mary. He was accustomed to call Mary his mother. It is difficult to tell how eagerly he served and honored her. He adorned her images with flowers and devoted the most fervent affections of his heart to her. He was wont to say jestingly, "My mother is very strange, if I bring her flowers, she says she does not want them, if I bring her cherries, she will not take them, and if I then ask her what she desires, she replies, 'I desire thy heart, for I live on hearts.'" That his heart belonged to Mary was apparent from the continued devout prayers which he recited in her honor and the tender words he applied to her, calling her his protectress, lady, patroness, mother and helper, from the simple and joyful songs with which he extolled her, and especially from the frequent ecstasies and flights which he experienced when he saw her image or heard her praises. Once, when the litany of Our Lady was being prayed in the church, he flew over 6 fellow religious at the words Holy Mary. At other times such flights occurred at the words, Holy Mother of God, Mother of Divine Grace, Gate of Heaven. Even on hearing the name of Mary he was often enraptured and lifted from the ground. His heart melted at the thought of the beauty of the Queen of Heaven. One day, while he was saying Mass, many persons saw him enraptured and lifted into the air and heard him exclaim with tears in his eyes, "Praise her, ye holy angels, with your songs, for I pine away because I cannot worthily praise her." Not satisfied that Mary should be loved and praised by all the saints and angels of paradise, he most earnestly desired that she be loved and praised by all men on earth. Some citizens of Copertino once came to the monastery at Gratella to visit him. "Why have you come?" he said to them. "Do you wish to visit Our Lady?" When they replied in the affirmative, he continued, "And what have you brought?" They replied, "The office and the rosary." "What office? What rosary?" he asked, for he well knew they had come out of curiosity. "My Lady wishes more, she desires the heart and the will." By these words he inflamed their hearts with love for Mary and, bidding them kneel, prayed the litany with them as he was accustomed to do with all who came to his cell. He also admonished all to repeat often the words, "Mary, thou refuge of sinners, Mother of God, be mindful of me." This ejaculatory prayer, he said, pleased the Blessed Virgin very much because she is justly called refuge of sinners. Joseph sought to honor the Mother of God by the frequent recital of the praises contained in the Litany of Loreto. Once, when the shepherds with whom he prayed the litany each Saturday in a chapel near the monastery at Gratella, were hindered from coming, he called with a loud voice to the sheep which he could see from afar, "Come hither, to revere the Mother of your God and my God." At these words the sheep, which were so far distant from Joseph that his voice could not have reached them, ran towards the chapel, without regarding the cries of the shepherd boys, and when they had come to the chapel, the saint joyfully began a litany. The animals replied in their own way to each praise which he uttered, so that, for instance, when he said Holy Mary, all cried Ba and in this manner completed the litany. On receiving the saint's blessing, they gamboled back to their pastures. The servant of God had acquired such confidence in his heavenly Mother that by reciting the litany he was able to exorcise devils and free the possessed. In serious dissensions he reconciled the litigants by saying to them, "Let us go to Mother, to Mother." In the name of the Mother of God, to whom he ascribed all good, he frequently promised to work miracles and occasionally wrought them without delay. Thus he once cured a blind woman by touching her eyes and saying, "May the Mother of God restore you to health." The Vicar General of Nardo was unwilling to bless the 3 crosses which Joseph had erected near Gratella because of the great heat, but acceded to the entreaties of the saint when he said, "My mother will not let you feel the heat." Although the solemnity lasted 3½ hours and the Vicar General wore a cope, he did not feel the least discomfort from the broiling sun. At times Joseph's mother, who was poor, came to seek his aid. To her he said, "The Madonna is my mother. I have nothing because I am poor. Take refuge to the Madonna, she will provide for you." In very deed she always gave opportune aid in some mysterious way. To a priest who was confined to bed by ulcers he said, "Do not lose courage, how long is it since you were at Gratella to see your mother?" "Alas," replied the sick man, "do you not see in what condition I am and that I can hardly move?" The servant of God then bandaged his wounds and stroked them saying, "Have you no confidence in your mother?" At the same moment the ulcers dried up and healed, and soon the priest recovered fully. Another priest hesitated to pray for a particular grace. The saint, seeing the cause of his doubt, said to him, "Take refuge to Mary, she will hear you." At times Joseph's mother, who was poor, came to seek his aid. To her he said, "The Madonna is my mother. I have nothing because I am poor. Take refuge to the Madonna, she will provide for you." In very deed she always gave opportune aid in some mysterious way. To a priest who was confined to bed by ulcers he said, "Do not lose courage, how long is it since you were at Gratella to see your mother?" "Alas," replied the sick man, "do you not see in what condition I am and that I can hardly move?" The servant of God then bandaged his wounds and stroked them saying, "Have you no confidence in your mother?" At the same moment the ulcers dried up and healed, and soon the priest recovered fully. Another priest hesitated to pray for a particular grace. The saint, seeing the cause of his doubt, said to him, "Take refuge to Mary, she will hear you." The prayer was heard. At another time the saint opened the lips of a dying man and, as he gave him a certain liquid to drink, asked him, "Do you feel better now?" The man replied, "Yes," and Joseph continued, "Then say nothing about me to anyone, but rather say the Mother of God, who is your mother and mine, has made you well." To be brief, Joseph's holiness began, as he himself attested, with devotion to Mary. The fame of his holiness was likewise due to the many graces which people received from Mary because of his prayer. During his whole life our saint called the Blessed Virgin Mother, and in dying he invoked her by that sweet name in the words of the Ave Maris Stella, "Show thyself a mother, offer him our sighs, who for us incarnate did not thee despise." At times Joseph's mother, who was poor, came to seek his aid. To her he said, "The Madonna is my mother. I have nothing because I am poor. Take refuge to the Madonna, she will provide for you." In very deed she always gave opportune aid in some mysterious way. To a priest who was confined to bed by ulcers he said, "Do not lose courage, how long is it since you were at Gratella to see your mother?" "Alas," replied the sick man, "do you not see in what condition I am and that I can hardly move?" The servant of God then bandaged his wounds and stroked them, saying, "Have you no confidence in your mother?" At the same moment the ulcers dried up and healed, and soon the priest recovered fully. Another priest hesitated to pray for a particular grace. The saint, seeing the cause of his doubt, said to him, "Take refuge to Mary, she will hear you." The prayer was heard. At another time the saint opened the lips of a dying man and, as he gave him a certain liquid to drink, asked him, "Do you feel better now?" The man replied, "Yes," and Joseph continued, "Then say nothing about me to anyone, but rather say the Mother of God, who is your mother and mine, has made you well." To be brief, Joseph's holiness began, as he himself attested, with devotion to Mary. The fame of his holiness was likewise due to the many graces which people received from Mary because of his prayer. During his whole life our saint called the Blessed Virgin Mother, and in dying he invoked her by that sweet name in the words of the Ave Maris Stella, "Show thyself a mother, offer him our sighs, who for us incarnate did not thee despise."